So Professor Jacob Stanley is Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2013, he was Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University. Professor Stanley has 4 other books which have won several awards, and he is here tonight to share his latest book, which is just out earlier this fall, How Fascism Works. If you please join me in a warm round of applause for Jacob.
So I thought I would just talk through a bit of my book and then open it up for questions, because one thing about this topic is that all of us, reality has a way of catching up with theory. So I think more and more people are well versed on the topic I shall be discussing. I recently spoke in Kiev to members of the parliament, and it was not really, I mean, they were much more sophisticated than I am about the topics about which I was speaking, although they had not, studied them in school. They had experienced them, and I think we're seeing that in our own politics and in the politics of a number of countries around the world right now. My previous book was called How Propaganda Works, and in it I argued that the topic of propaganda had been overlooked in political philosophy. It was a book aimed only at philosophy professors. It never occurred to me that people who are not philosophy professors would read it or care about it. But suddenly I found, and so the topic, what I was discussing is that from Plato onwards, there was a tension. There was sort of, liberal democracy was a system that people had always felt was vulnerable to demagoguery, and so liberal democracy as a system was widely regarded by figures like Plato and Hobbes as far too idealistic, and even those who argued for it, like Rousseau, held that there needed to be dramatic cultural changes in order to allow its possibility. There needed to be no dramatic inequality, no specific resentment that that arises from inequality. So you needed dramatic cultural changes in order to allow for liberal democracy, because otherwise a demagogue would come and foment fear and hatred, represent himself as the savior and protector, and divide society, raise fear of one group, and present himself as a protector. I'm going to use him and he for the demagogue, because I think for reasons that we will discuss. And present himself as the protector, and then end democracy. This is essentially the story that Plato tells in Book 8 of the Republic. I'm often asked, when I first started writing this book, How Fascism Works, and got an agent, the standard question I was asked was, why a philosopher on the topic of fascism? Why would anyone want to hear a philosopher talk about this topic? It's about history. Historians are allowed to write about this topic, but not philosophers. But actually, if you go back in the history of philosophy, back to Plato's Republic, there's a character in Plato's Republic, Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus confronts Socrates with a challenge. He says, virtue is a weakness. It's all about power. Like, it's just power. And Plato was, of course, not defending democracy. But Plato is defending truth and knowledge against Thrasymachus. And Plato wants to describe the whole of Plato's Republic as a reply to this character who thinks that it's all about, in modern parlance, I guess the Greek translation would be winning. It's all about winning. And everything else, like losers, anyone who has any kind of sense of justice is a loser. And this is what Thrasymachus is arguing. And Plato writes the Republic to respond. And Plato argues that Callipolis, his city based upon justice, requires philosophers love it because we're supposed to rule everything, but we're also very low paid in Callipolis, so that's not something we like. So the idea is that there's this city based on justice and philosophers, and it's based on respect for truth and knowledge. So Plato sets up the dialectic of the Republic as a battle between power and knowledge and truth. Now Plato is of course no fan of democracy, but I think he's right that there's always this battle between a system based just on power and its alternatives which are based on truth. And liberal democracy is based on truth. Liberal democracy has two values, liberty and equality, and both are based on truth. You can't be free without truth. Nobody thinks that the people of North Korea are free. And why don't we think that they're free? They're not free because they've been lied to. And if you've been lied to, then you don't know what you're doing. You don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You're just basically, acting almost randomly. Or someone else, the person who's lying to you, is controlling your actions. Because they're telling you false things and you're doing things for those reasons, but those are not real reasons. You don't know what you're doing. So liberty requires truth. We don't think that people who've been lied to are free. Similarly, equality requires truth. Because equality in liberal democracy is not full equality, economic equality. It's political equality. The capacity to speak truth to power. And speaking truth to power requires truth. So both liberty and equality require truth. So if you're going to smash liberal democracy, you need to smash truth. And in general, if you have a system based on power, then the opposition to that is truth, because truth is its own kind of power. In a system based on truth, truth is the power, not you, not your self-interest. So there's an old philosophical debate about how to respond to Thrasymachus, how to respond to despotism. Now, modern day fascism is not just Thrasymachus. It's not just the despot. Modern day fascism is a slightly beefed up animal. It requires the 19th century, it requires Fichte's Die Rede an der deutschen Nation, it requires nationalism. It's not just the leader, it's the leader plus the nation. But nevertheless, its central core, its truth-destroying central core, is something that philosophers have been familiar with since Plato, at least. In the book, I go through, the book is not about fascist policies. It's about fascist propaganda and rhetoric. I think that, so as a philosopher, I'm familiar with the battles between truth, between liberal democracy, and between power, and its antithesis, power. But you do need to look at recent history to see the modern versions of fascism, but I think it's not just philosophers need to be. This book differs in two ways from the literature, from other literature. First of all, historians tend to tend to start from particular times and places, because historians are like that. But right now what we're seeing is a transnational fascist movement, like we saw in the 20s and 30s with universal fascism. We're seeing a transnational fascist movement that's connected. Netanyahu and Putin met for like 10 hours, I think. I mean, my partner and I can't even be together in the same room for 10 hours. So we have Steve Bannon creating the movement in Europe with already the Italian Five-Star movement behind him. We have, it turns out Steve Bannon has been advising Bolsonaro in Brazil. So we have these movements all linked. Orban is linked to Putin, is linked to Law and Justice. They're linked to Seehofer, the far right in Seehofer's in CSU, but he's an anti-immigrant. He's harshly anti-immigrant. These movements are all linked. And of course, Putin famously is linked to all of them. Now, my book differs. So recently we've seen a bunch of books, which I think of as the crisis of democracy literature. And the crisis of democracy literature overlaps with my thinking to a large extent. But my thinking crucially differs from it, because what you find in the crisis of democracy literature, perhaps the most, I think, problematic example of this being Madeleine Albright's book, is this idea that the United States is this thriving liberal democracy, and it's being invaded by this foreign European ideology of fascism. Oh no, we fought it before, we'll fight it again. And, as if fascism is foreign to the United States. My book is based in, if there's any history my book is based on, first and foremost, it's US history. It's our own history of racism that deeply influenced Nazi Germany, our own history of anti-immigrant sentiment that deeply influenced Nazi Germany. Hitler's Mein Kampf is about the construction of a national state. The idea is to tear down the semblance of a sort of bureaucratic state, destroy the state and replace it with a national state, which is a group of people unified by the fact that they're all Aryans and they're all self-sufficient, and they all decide to work for a common cause together as self-sufficient, independent Aryans, and that common cause is their Aryan national identity. And the state he takes as his model is the United States. So he has this one passage where, he has many passages, both in Mein Kampf and in Hitler's second book. He takes the United States as a model for many reasons. But he says, in one passage in Mein Kampf in particular, he says, the country that is my model, he starts off the passage by saying, around the world we are laughed upon and we are laughed about for our immigration policies, which are the mockery of the world. We allow everyone in. He said, and then he says, there's one country, however, that has wise counsel in its immigration policies, and as a result is making the initial steps towards a national state in the sense that I describe here. That is not our pattern German republic, but I mean the United States of America, which in its immigration policies has restricted its laws to allow only the finest racial stock in. He's speaking of the 1924 Immigration Act, praised by Attorney General Jeff Sessions, which only allows the finest Aryan stock in. So think of the president's remark about shithole countries and how come we don't get any immigration from Norway anymore? How come it's only shithole countries? So Hitler says, they only allow. So the 1924 Immigration Act was designed to restrict immigration, Asian immigration. That was also in the 19th century, to restrict African American to African immigration, all immigration other than Northern European immigration, essentially, keeping Jews out. So Hitler praises this, and he also notes that the Immigration Act restricted immigrants from a health point of view, which they're now doing again. They're now very strongly restricting. They said we only want healthy immigrants. They're even using that language. So the United States, Nancy MacLean's 1994 book, Behind the Veil of Chivalry, about the Ku Klux Klan, discusses the ways in which the Ku Klux Klan affects Nazi Germany. The Ku Klux Klan, Nazi Germany are both. The idea was to protect womanhood against pure womanhood, Aryan womanhood, against the threat of mixing. Many other overlaps. Will Rogers, in a 1933 newspaper column, says says, they say that Hitler's imitating Mussolini, but he doesn't look like he wants to be emperor. He looks like he wants to be Kliegel. So explicit reference to the KKK. So, and of course my colleague Jim Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, is about how the Nuremberg laws were based upon our anti-miscegenation laws, except for the fact that they looked at us and they were like, no, one drop, that's untethered from reality. That's madness. Let's go with 1/8. Okay, so let me quickly describe the structure of fascist politics and fascist ideology in the 10 chapters in this book with that background. So my book, I draw on Nazi Germany, I draw on Putin's Russia, I draw on Mussolini, and I draw on the 1920s, 1930s in the United States. I draw on what I take to be very strong antecedents to fascism, the Confederacy. You find in the American South, you find whites talking about protecting the homeland from northern invaders. So you find this kind of hyper-nationalism. You find a lot of the elements of fascism. So I think that modern day fascism has a lot of antecedents, and although it coalesces in sort of a natural social kind in the mid-20th century, you can see very clear antecedents all the way dating back in the history of philosophy, but very clearly, you don't really get modern day fascism unless you have hysteria about communists. You don't have modern day fascism unless people are saying universities are filled with cultural Marxists and feminists, and that really doesn't happen until the 20th century. It's not like in the Confederacy people were complaining about universities' gender studies programs. So there's certain, the protocols of the Elders of Zion is kind of required, like, liberalism is the enemy, Marxism and liberalism. So when there's no threat of Marxism before Marxism, you don't really get, Goebbels says, the ordinary burgher will not run into our arms unless they're fearful of the Bolsheviks coming to steal their property. So what they did, what you do in fascist propaganda is you represent the center-left movement as socialists. So we're safe because this would never happen here. But what Goebbels is saying is that you should call the center-left party, the SPD, Bolsheviks. You should say they're communists and they're coming to take your property. And then you'll get people to flee into the arms of the Nazis, which is what happened. The SPD support plummeted as the Nazi Party made people terrified of encroaching communism by painting the center-left as communists. So in William Sheridan Allen's book, which studies one town that went from SPD to Nazi in 5 years, he talks about this process of repeatedly painting the towns, repeatedly painting the center left as dangerous communists. Another thing I want to mention before I just run through quickly the 10 points is another tactic we're seeing. Like, people are acting now like the attacks on university campuses, oh my God, they're not allowing right-wing speakers into campus. Anyone ever hear that? So as if that's new, and if student protests against that are new, that is like absurd. If you read the Nazi literature on National Socialism, in William Sheridan Allen's book, I'm forgetting the title right now, but if someone can Google it maybe, but he talks about the ultranationalists, the Völkische Parteien, would put on ultranationalist plays, and the students would march down from the university and battle them with bricks on the street. Students facing ultranationalists is not new. That's what students do. And the Nazi trick is to get the ultranationalists into the university by saying, You know, oh, well, we have to, the trick, the Nazi trick, the fascist trick is always this. Think about it, yeah, I think it's better, rather than going through the 10 chapters, let me explain a couple classic fascist tricks. So here's a classic fascist trick with conspiracy theories. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You say, the newspapers are controlled by the Jews, and you know it because the newspapers don't say they're controlled by the Jews. So then the newspapers are pressured to say, oh, well, okay, I guess this person's Jewish. And then it gives credence to the view that the newspapers are controlled by the Jews. Similarly, you say the universities are controlled by the communists. You know it because the fascists aren't allowed to talk, or whatever. I mean, not just that. You know it because whatever acts, you know, I mean, this is, I'm talking about in the 20s and 30s. It's a little different in Germany because a lot of the universities were there were many ultranationalist universities. So the structure of the relationship between the universities and but you see this in Eastern Europe right now. The universities are controlled by the leftists because they don't allow us in. And then you allow them in. And then, of course, it gives this extra legitimacy. I mean, right now, Charles Murray, who is not, you know, Charles Murray is not some superstar academic, is giving like 400 talks in every university in the country. He's being brought around. You know, he goes from NYU to Princeton to Yale to give talks. Why? You know, just to, you know, well, first of all, it's a provocation, which is part of this politics. You provoke, and you say, look at all the leftists. You raise panic about the leftists. And you use the universities, you use moments to create panic, and you create panic in the population that the leftists are taking over. That the leftists control the media. Jews, leftists, it doesn't really make a difference. Cultural Marxists. You raise panic that the institutions like the universities and the media are controlled by them, and then you get people into a panic. And you say, see, you need a strong hand. So let me quickly run through the. That's a classic tactic. I begin How Propaganda Works with a quote from Goebbels. Usually, I start most of my dinner parties that way. Where Goebbels says it's something like, "It would be the greatest joke of democracy that its freedoms led to the victory of its worst enemy," by which he means, of course, freedom of speech. That doesn't mean I'm against freedom of speech, but I am very much for understanding history and understanding the riskiness of the system of democracy. I am very committed to the system of democracy. I'm very pro free speech, but I'm also very pro not being a fool about what can be done with free speech. And what happens when panic is spread about leftists controlling institutions? Because that's how this, you know, leftists controlling the media, leftists controlling Hollywood, leftists controlling the decadent art of Vienna. So that's the modern way. That's the way in which fascism differs from, say, what you find in the Confederacy and what you find before. In that it has this weird dance with leftism and Marxism. It works by creating a panic of institutions controlled by Marxists, by leftists, by communists. Okay, I will quickly go through the 10 chapters, the 10 tactics of fascism. The first is the mythic past. The nice thing, the reason one always goes back to Mussolini and Hitler is they're very explicit about these things, or Alfred Rosenberg, who was not Jewish. So Rosenberg and Mussolini, sorry, that was a joke. Rosenberg was a major Nazi tactician of the 20s. So Rosenberg and Mussolini, they talk about the usefulness of a mythic past. What you're doing in fascism is you're trying to destroy truth and replace it with power. Power works hierarchically, right? So there's the most powerful person, and there's a hierarchy of groups. So there's fascism works where one group has more value than other groups, and then the leader represents that group. So you in conditions where people feel anxious, what you do is you tell them that their anxiety is due to the fact that they've lost their position in society due to liberals, due to feminists, due to foreigners, and in the past, there was this pure past. You see this very clearly with like the Hindutva movement in India. You see, there was this pure past where you were worshipped, you were admired just because of your national identity, just because of your race, just because of your religion, just because of your gender. The mythic past is always hierarchical. It's always patriarchal, because what you're always trying to do in fascist propaganda is you're trying to like invoke these values, these fascist values and patriarchy involves the patriarchal father whose authority derives from his strength, and the leader stands to his nation like the patriarchal father stands to his family. So you're always trying to talk about, you're always trying to like heighten patriarchal sentiment, because then people are like, oh wow, society should be patriarchal. So the mythic past, so Mussolini says in a passage I talk about in chapter 1, and Rosenberg says basically the same thing, the myth of our nation is the glory of its past. So you always have this mythic past that's been lost, and you get people to connect their feeling of anxiety to nostalgia for a past that never was, a nostalgic, pure ethnic past, and then you can get them to be furious at the people who've taken it away. Chapter 2 is called Propaganda. There's a number of things that surprised me when I was doing this research. One thing that surprised me, I was reading Kate Mann's excellent book, Down Girl, and she talks about how, when men run against women for political office, they run anti-corruption campaigns. I heard this happened in this country, and she talks about Australia, a similar case in Australia. And she says it has to do with the fact that what anti-corruption there means is that the ordinary order is being corrupted. And then I was reading literature on National Socialism, and like Richard Grunberger in his 1975 book, he says, it's funny, everybody thinks that the Nazis were like these pure anti-Semites who were deeply, purely devoted to killing Jews, but in fact, most of them didn't care at all about killing Jews. They cared a lot about Jewish art and Jewish property and Jewish gold and Jewish money, and they really just didn't care at all about killing Jews. It's not that they hated Jews, it's not that they didn't hate Jews, it's that they were just thugs and criminals and mobsters. That was the majority of the Nazi party. And he says, and it's weird because people don't think of them that way. People think of them as like dedicated, but they weren't. They were most of them were just thugs who wanted money. He said they were totally corrupt, and yet they ran an anti-corruption campaign. Putin, 2011, who's Putin, nice guy, I'm sure. But Putin, that joke doesn't work in Ukraine. It's like even when I added it's a joke, there was not even. Putin, 2011 campaign, an anti-corruption campaign. Putin himself has very little money, but I think both his daughters have several $1 billion in the bank from their jobs, and many of his friends do as well. So Putin runs anti-corruption campaigns, and it looks like. And then you look at our own country. And W.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, which is, I think, maybe the most essential book to read, that and Arendt's Origins. But don't buy this book. Buy Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. Sorry, my publishers hate it when I do that. Buy both. This is shorter. But in Black Reconstruction, Du Bois talks about how Reconstruction ends. Supposedly because black majority areas are corrupt. And Du Bois deeply researches this and says, no they weren't, they're much less corrupt. What did corruption mean? He says corruption meant that 4 million black Americans could vote. That's what corruption meant. And then you look and you think about, just inspect, if you're white like me, inspect your ordinary cultural intuitions. about what a corrupt American city looks like. It looks like it's run by ethnic groups, right? That's what we're told, right? The Irish, the Italian, black, in the Midwest, Michigan's Emergency Manager Act took the 6 black majority cities and they said they're all corrupt. We're going to replace them by emergency managers we're going to fire the city council, fire the mayors. Of course, Flint, Michigan happens. You know, that's anti-corruption for you. Take an $80 million bond out and poison the city. So corruption in fascist politics means the wrong people are ruling. And you can think about it like this. In fascist politics, you destroy truth, you destroy competence, you represent all politics as us versus them. So the idea is, like, if they're ruling, they're handing out the goodies. We should be handing out the goodies. So Arendt says that fascist politics resembles a mafia family because it's based on power and loyalty. You know that you're in a fascist moment when the leader puts their family members or their business cronies into positions of administrative power, because then they're running things like a mafia. So because it's power and loyalty. So other chapters are hierarchy. Hierarchy is another way to destroy truth, because we all pretty much suck to the same degree. So it's a lie that some of us are better than others. So you get people used to that lie. You get people used to a politics of myth, and you get them comfortable in a politics of myth, and you take them away from truth. You get them to not care about truth. They just care about, they're comfortable with this myth of superiority. They're comfortable with us versus them, with everything being that. Victimhood. So they talk about, so the idea there in fascist politics, the dominant group are history's greatest victims. Serbian Academy's 1986 memorandum talks about how the Serbian people are the greatest victims, most persecuted group in human history. Hitler just is, Mein Kampf is a dirge to German suffering after Versailles, and ethnic German suffering in other countries. The dominant group is a victim of encroaching equality, of feminists, of minority groups. They're victims of these groups. And what are the characteristics of these groups that are lower down in the hierarchy? Well, they're criminals. So law and order is another chapter, the next chapter. The outgroup men are criminals. The outgroup men are just, and what crime do they do? Rape. All over. So the Rohingya, if you look at Myanmar, in 2012, 3 Rohingya men raped a Rakhine woman. All the Rohingya are then accused of being rapists, placed in a couple hundred villages, and vicious propaganda is directed against them for 5 years. And then mass atrocities are visited upon them, centrally murder and rape. But nobody considers it. Like the idea that the Rohingya women are suffering from mass rape is not even something that occurs to people, and you still find them saying the Rohingya are rapists. It's the outgroup. Tim Snyder made this point the other night. Like, rape is only a crime that can be visited on the in-group. And then all this politics is harshly anti-gay. Fascist politics is harshly anti-gay. Look at Eastern Europe right now. Look at the Nazi Germany. All fascist politics. Look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, who said, "I'd rather have a dead son than a gay son. I'd rather have my son die in an accident than on the way home than come home with a man with a mustache." Fascist politics is harshly anti-gay because it reinforces patriarchal politics. Sexual freedom is a kind of freedom, and you want to hammer freedom, and replace it with authority and tradition. Chapter 9 is Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, the values of the heartland. You know, the social basis of fascist movements is almost invariably, not universally, comes from the rural areas, and certainly the politics works that way. Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf is called My Time in Vienna, and it comes to Vienna and it's decadence and foreigners and Jews and more Jews. In Europe, in Romania, Jews are only allowed to own property in the city. So Jews get associated with the city. The outgroup, you know, the cities are the places where there's mixtures between the outgroup men and the in-group. And then I noticed in my country, the expression inner city means something. It means the place, not where Jews live, well, okay, also Jews, but minority groups live, right? So it's always and chapter 10, the final chapter is called Arbeit macht frei, and I owe the title to Tim Snyder, who said to me once, he said, you know, when white people in America, that means work shall make you free. It was on the gates of Auschwitz. And Tim Snyder said to me, you know, when white Americans say black people are lazy, what they mean is what the Nazis meant by that. The outgroup, they're criminal and they're lazy. That's how you characterize them. The Jews were lazy. Again and again, I've sat in Sterling Library with education textbooks that show, you know, pictures of Jewish hands, allegedly Jewish hands, soft Jewish hands. Haven't worked. So you have to make them work for free. You make the outgroup work for free to give them a work ethic, and that's the way to make them free. And at the basis of fascist ideology is social Darwinism. It's about winning. It's about the group on the top works harder, and they're the hard workers, they're the law-abiding hard workers, and the outgroup are the criminal, lazy ones. I'm going to end there and take questions. Thank you.